Hello and welcome back. We're about to talk about tissues, but before we do, I wanted to show you that this information is absolutely applicable in any type of natural medicine practice. You may not think that peroxisomes or lysosomes or the resting membrane potential really serves much purpose in terms of having knowledge of it, but I have a smattering of a very small number of some papers that I just pulled up to show you that the knowledge of these things, the terminology, understanding what they are, will only serve you better in terms of improving you in the particular clientele or patient base demographic that you see. So here is just one paper. This is admittedly a little bit more for myself. The reason why I've been teaching the levels of organization for a really long time. Nobody taught it to me. I looked at it and you know, it just made sense, and I teach it the way that I think it needs to be taught. But this was a really interesting paper showing you that I'm not totally full of myself. Is the significance of levels of organization for scientific research, a heuristic approach. And they basically said that this concept of levels of organization has come under fire as being useless for scientific and philosophical purposes. But in this paper, they say that we show that levels is actually a remarkably resilient and constructive conceptual tool that can be and is, and in fact is, very useful for a whole variety of purposes. And to this effect, they articulate an account of an importance of levels of the levels concept seen in light of this status as a major organizing concept of biology. And they say that we argue that its usefulness of the levels is seen in heuristic contributions to this concept. So anyways, you know, I may go over the levels of organization in every single, everything that I teach, but even the levels of organization, and that was a fairly recent paper is being talked about. Here's a couple papers just merely on peroxisomes. I'm not going to go into them, but I want to show you that researchers are asking questions and trying to find out more about these things. So here's the peroxisomes, a couple quick papers. The peroxisome, still a mysterious organelle. The other one, very interesting, pro- and antioxidant functions of the peroxisome-mitochondria connections and its impact on aging and disease. Here's a couple other papers. Endoplasmic reticulum stress is a thing, and I actually may do a course on this at some point in the future. But here's a couple papers that knowing what the endoplasmic reticulum is and knowing how it functions, and when you do that, then you know what can go wrong. The natural occurring compounds targeting endoplasmic reticulum stress, and the other one, again, natural products targeting endoplasmic reticulum stress pathway for the treatment of cardiovascular diseases. Here's a cool paper. I thought this is really just basically on the functions of CoQ10, but here's my point, is you may come across this paper because you're interested in learning more about CoQ10, but this paper will hopefully make more sense to you with the knowledge of certain things. So here's what they say regarding CoQ10. The new aspects have developed from the recognition that coenzyme Q10 can undergo oxidation reduction reactions in other cell membranes such as lysosomes or the Golgi apparatus or plasma membranes. In mitochondria and lysosomes, coenzyme Q10 undergoes reduction oxidation cycles during which it transfers protons across the membrane to form a proton gradient. One of the things I think I've said at some point was that one of the functions of CoQ10 is to create a certain acidity or maintain a certain pH inside of lysosomes so that they're optimal in what they do. And this is why it creates that CoQ10 has the ability to do oxidation reduction reactions, which if you do the mitochondria, of course, will make sense, and creating a proton gradient. And that basically in English means that it's maintaining the pH inside the lysosomes. So here's another paper you might find interesting. This is the regulation of the intestinal tight junction, which we now hopefully have a pretty good understanding of, by natural polyphenols, a mechanistic perspective. So let's say you wanted to try to find some alternative way of treating intestinal permeability. And so this, you could make sense of this article. Recent studies show the role of plant polyphenols in regulation of the intestinal barrier and prevention of intestinal inflammatory diseases. Here we summarize the regulatory pathways and mediators linking polyphenols to their beneficial effects on tight junctions specifically, and gut epithelial, which we're going to talk about now, barrier functions, and provide useful information about using polyphenols as nutraceuticals for intestinal diseases. Now this last paper might seem a little funny, but I want to show you that you know what it's talking about. So I'll read you the title. It may not make too much sense now, and some of the text will. Herbal extracts modulate the amplitude and frequency of slow waves, which we'll talk about probably in level 2B in the gastrointestinal tract and the muscular contractions, in circular smooth muscle, which you'll know what that is also in level 2B, of mouse small intestines. Now, this first part's not going to make a whole lot of sense. Herbal preparations like this STW5 are widely used drugs in the treatment of dyspepsia and motility, contraction-related disorders of the gastrointestinal tract. That's cool. This STW5 is a phytotherapeutic agent consisting of a fixed mixture of 9 different plant extracts. But what they say is that we don't really know how it works, and so they tested it here. Now look at this. It says the resting membrane potential of smooth muscle cells was negative 59. Now I used 70 as an average for cells, but here it says that, the resting membrane potential was 59. And this resting membrane potential was significantly depolarized. And you know what that means? It's going closer to threshold and depolarizing to 9.6, which is positive. That's depolarized. The depolarizing effects can mainly be attributed to the constituents, and then they talk about some of the specific things there. But the point is, you can read a paper like that and make sense of it. And so that's the purpose of this course. That's the purpose of level 1 in biochemistry and this level 2, A and B, in physiology, because, here goes the soapbox again. Without knowledge of the basic physiological principles and the parts and the names and how they function, you can't make sense of a lot of things. And unfortunately in this industry, if you go to seminars, they just jump to the cool, sexy stuff, the cool, sexy tests, or whatever. But if you lack basic knowledge of how some of these things actually work, then there's no solid foundation for these, and all we're left to do is basically just parrot what we hear back from people without ability to critically think about it ourselves. Anyhow, all right, so tissues. Now, it's been said that there's over 200 distinct cell types in the body, and they have a lot of the same machinery and parts on the inside. They do vary considerably in their structure and therefore their function. But they're not just randomly and haphazardly placed around the body. They usually occur in sheets or in lines, if you will. And that's because, and when they do so, that's what a tissue is. A tissue is really, as we've said many times, is just a bunch of cells. When you take a bunch of cells together, then it's a tissue. And as you know, there's only 4 types of tissues in the body, and we're going to talk about each one of them a little bit here. We're going to start out with epithelial tissue. The 4 tissue types are epithelial, connective, muscular, or muscle, which is cardiac, skeletal, and smooth muscle. We'll talk a little bit about those. And then neural tissue, which we'll talk a little bit about, but more so in the nervous system. So we're going to start with epithelial tissue. Now, epithelial tissue is just cells. We'll talk about all the different pieces here. But basically, it lines the body. So if there's a cavity, like the hollow, like the stomach, it could be considered an organ or a cavity, it's lined. The chambers of the heart are lined. Our skin is epithelial tissue. It lines our entire body. The entire digestive tract is a tube. The whole thing is lined. And I have a schematic to sort of show you here. The respiratory system, heading down is epithelial tissue, and then lining the lungs is epithelial tissue. The entire circulatory system is made up of epithelial tissue. And in fact, when a vessel is lined with an epithelial tissue or cell, it's called endothelium. As you probably know, in the gastrointestinal tract, those are called enterocytes. Those are just merely epithelial cells. Glands, hormone-secreting glands, as well as things like mucus-secreting glands, or digestive enzymes in the pancreas come from epithelial cells. So epithelial cells are everywhere. They're very, very cool cells. All these tissues are cool, but epithelial cells are cool. And so what I've drawn out here is this schematic that hopefully you can make sense of, trying to highlight all the different places that we find epithelial cells or epithelium. So the black line surrounding the whole thing would be the integumentary system, which is just skin. So we're lined, our whole body is lined with epithelial cells. Here we have the circulatory system that's rounding around here. That whole thing is going to be lined with epithelial cells. And in a second, after I erase all this, we'll talk about the different types. There's different shapes and sizes of the different epithelial cells. Sometimes there's just a single layer of these cells. Other times they're stacked up pretty high and in different places of the body for different functions. So for example, why not? I didn't plan on doing this. But for example, when we have the circulatory system, we have things going on like exchange. And we might be exchanging, for example, oxygen for CO2 at the cellular level, epithelial cells probably, at the cellular level. Well, we don't want a whole lot of resistance, so it's just a single line, and this will make sense in a second, of what's called simple squamous epithelium, or inside the blood vessels would be endothelium. And so this is an example. The whole circulatory system is lined with epithelial cells. The respiratory system, I said, and we'll talk about this in level 2B, the respiratory system is so cool. But the tube going down into the lungs itself, it's all epithelial. It's a specific kind of epithelial cell because of where it is, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial. And then in the lungs themselves, this is gas exchange. So we again have just a single layer of these simple squamous epithelium lining the gastrointestinal tract. They're called alveoli cells that line the respiratory tract to be able to do gas exchange, for example. Here we have the entire gastrointestinal tract. This is all lined with epithelial cells, which incidentally, which is also awesome, changes as you go along. Upstairs, when we're swallowing food, the esophagus has, it could be abrasive if you swallow, maybe if you don't chew your food thoroughly. And so the type of epithelial cells that you find there, because some of them can get sloughed off like our skin, it's a whole stack of them. But then when you get down into the stomach, and I doubt I'll show you the histology slides, it changes on a dime. It goes from these stacks of epithelial cells to a single line, but now it's a different size because it's not gas exchange, it's going to be nutrient exchange. So then we're going to have simple one layer, columnar epithelium lining the majority of the gastrointestinal tract. And as you know, if you ever had a rough poop come out, that there's an area down here where it could be abrasive. A single layer of cells is not going to fare well there. So again, just like at the top, at the bottom, we have stacks of epithelial cells in case things don't come out as easily. The kidneys are awesome. We'll talk about those in level 2B. But there's a lot of exchange going on between the circulatory system and the kidneys, which we'll talk about. In the kidneys, when you look at the nephron, the functional part that's essentially filtering the blood of the kidneys, all million of them, those are lined, because it's exchanged, as a single layer, simple. These are cuboidal epithelial cells, because it's not just gas exchange, and we don't want it to be too easy because there's other things that are being exchanged. Here would be the urinary system, and the bladder is lined. And that's a different type of cell too, because the bladder is the only one that can expand if you hold your urine for a little while, and then if you go, then it sort of, I can't say it contracts necessarily, but it gets smaller. And so that's a different kind of epithelium called transitional epithelium. It has the ability to change shape based on how much urine somebody decides they want to hold. The reproductive tract, here's the female reproductive tract, is lined, the fallopian tubes and the uterus, the whole bit is lined. In places like the liver, where we're making proteins, and that's being transported into and out of the circulatory system, is also epithelial cells. And I don't even have all of them on here. And then what I have here are, in these particular cases, and I'll show you what that is, these are exocrine glands. They're, if you remember phagocytosis and endocytosis and exocytosis, these are exocrine glands, and these are producing a substance and releasing it into or out of the body. Now, technically, the gastrointestinal tract is kind of out of the body when you think about it, just a tube connecting the outside world. So this is an exocrine gland, say, for example, from the pancreas, and these epithelial cells are producing digestive enzymes that in an exocrine fashion are being released into the gastrointestinal tract. Here, this exocrine gland might be a sebaceous gland, for example, releasing sweat into the skin. And then here we have more epithelial cells, simple cuboidal cells, and this would be an example of an endocrine gland. Now this could be anything from thyroid or the pancreatic islets that have beta cells and alpha cells making a variety of different hormones, but these are all epithelial cells. Epithelial cells do all of these things. And epithelial cells now have very similar characteristics. So one of them is that they're glandular. So when you are talking about a hormone, that hormone was probably produced by epithelial cells. Maybe it was in the adrenal gland, maybe it was in the testes, maybe it was in the thymus. But these are epithelial cells, tend to also be the glandular portion, the hormone synthesizing and releasing portion of a particular gland, like the thyroid gland. They are sheets that tend to line the body, which we just took a look at. One thing to know is that they're highly cellular. And what this means is there's not a lot of intracellular space around epithelial cells. I'll say that again. That epithelial tissue is highly cellular. It's just packed cells together, and there's not a lot of that space or interstitial space, or therefore interstitial fluid surrounding some of these. What's interesting, I've always found, is that epithelial cells are avascular. Now what that means is, so A means not, vascular means blood supply. So I'll explain that here, but if here we have two epithelial cells, that means that if they're avascular, there's not a blood vessel that goes into it. That you'll have blood vessels that hang out nearby, obviously, but they're completely avascular. They do not have a blood supply that feeds into them directly. It may be nearby and things can diffuse across cell membranes, but it's not directly innervated by a blood vessel. They're avascular. And that's interesting, and I'm not going to get into that too much here. I'll erase this in just a second. Right now, this would be a layer of simple epithelium. If it's a single layer, it's simple epithelium. If it's multiple layers, it's called stratified. Now imagine that this had more cells, epithelial cells, on top of it. The ones down here would be the closest to the blood supply that's nearby, that's diffusing things out of it. So these are the only cells that have access, immediate access, to anything that's in the blood. And the second that they start to go above, and this is like the soil, this is where stuff grows and it gets pushed up. So the cells above this don't really have a blood supply as much, and the further and further they get away, they don't have any life support and they'll eventually die. And that's how our skin is, for example, is we have this, on our skin, we have this very robust bottom layer that is constantly reproducing itself, making more cells, and it has a blood supply to help fuel it to do so. And as it makes more cells, and they get pushed up, and then they can live for a little while, and then a little longer, and then eventually they're so far away from the source that they just start to die, and that's when we have our dead skin cells that slough off every single day. Now, down here, I want to just have a couple pieces of terminology because it is something that you might come across. The upper portion of an epithelial cell that's closest to what it is lining is referred to as the apical portion, the top portion. Similarly, the bottom portion that's furthest away from the lining is referred to as the basal region. So if, for example, we could use these little guys here, the portion that is, well, let's say the portion of the cell that's closest to the blood itself would be the apical portion. And then the part that was further from the blood, that was more attached to the connective tissue underneath, would be the basal. Now, if you take, for an example, we can use this exocrine gland or this endocrine gland. Since this is the hollowing, everything around here would be connective tissue. Since this is the hollowing on the inside, the lining, then the sections on the inside here, these would be the apical portion. Even though it doesn't look like the top, like this is the apical portion of this cell. And you may say, well, it's pointing downwards, but it's the part that's exposed to space that it's lining. On the other hand, down here, this would all be the basal portion. And similarly, you'd have the apical portion is the one that's facing outwards to the lining, because over here would be connective tissue, and that's the basal. Now, how do these epithelial cells attach themselves but keep separate from the underlying connective tissue? Well, at the bottom portion here in blue, it's called the basal lamina, basal lamina. And the basal lamina is mostly glycoproteins and collagen, and it's designed to be sort of a sticky substance that can adhere to the underlying connective tissue, but then separate itself from the underlying connective tissue. Now, the underlying connective tissue produces something called reticular lamina, and together those two laminas, or laminae, I suppose, the basal lamina and the reticular lamina form what's called the basement membrane. That may be a term that you come across. The basement membrane of the epithelial cells is what essentially fixes it to the underlying connective tissue below. So once again, and I do have a couple more things, sorry. The functions are easy. One of the major functions of epithelial cells is protection. It protects us physically, obviously, by a barrier. It protects us chemically when you think about it. So, for example, the skin secretes a number of things that are protecting us from a chemical perspective, and then a biological perspective as well. Again, the skin will protect us from things like sunlight, in the case of biological protection, can produce some antibacterial substances, if you want to call it that, that protects us biologically as well. So the stomach produces hydrochloric acid. One of the functions of hydrochloric acid is to protect us from microbes that we might be consuming. So epithelial cells protect us physically, biologically, as well as chemically. They also are involved in secretion, which we talked about in terms of glands, and I'll show you that. In terms of glands. And then lastly is essentially they're in charge of controlling how permeable one of these linings is. And then lastly, I just wanted to draw out a little bit better the difference between, so these are all epithelial cells, the difference between an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. So an exocrine gland has the epithelial cells, and again, underneath here would be the basal lamina, the reticular lamina, and would be the basement membrane, and there will be some kind of, depending on where it is in the body, we'll talk about connective tissues in a bit, different types of connective tissue that's found in this area down here. This is an exocrine gland, and these epithelial cells will produce a substance that is eventually released out to the surface. Now the surface could be the skin, or an exocrine gland, like the exocrine portion of the pancreas, the level 2B. The exocrine portion of the pancreas is releasing digestive enzymes into the opening of the gastrointestinal tract. And then lastly, here we might have an endocrine gland. And an endocrine gland, here's the blood supply. Now remember, epithelial cells are technically avascular. They don't have a direct blood supply going into them, feeding them nutrients, but they'll be around a blood supply so that things can diffuse and they can get what they need. So here's the blood supply, and then all these cells out here are epithelial cells, and they'll release their glandular secretions. Maybe it's neurotransmitters, or perhaps it's a hormone that when it's released goes into circulation in an endocrine or paracrine or apocrine, not apocrine, fashion. So that's a little bit about epithelial tissue made up of cells. They're avascular, they're highly cellular, there's not a lot of intracellular space surrounding them. They're involved in a number of different things, but mostly they line the body for reasons of protection, for reasons of secretion, for reasons of controlling permeability. The location of them, as you'll see in just a second, will dictate the type of epithelial cells, whether it's squamous or cuboidal or columnar or pseudostratified ciliated columnar, or whether there's multiple layers and it's simple or it's stratified, and so we'll talk a little bit about that next.